I think the guys alluded to that in the video. We all know that it's a pretty thankless task. Um, and on a day like today, I'd like to bet many of you are on Opal 4 and chuck in a bit of COVID and COVID numbers going up. I guess the site office probably feels a bit like Cobra today, where all the decisions are being made. But equally, it can be the place where all the blame is laid as well. And actually, there's not enough discharges, there's not enough beds. It must be the site team's fault, when actually we know that you can't create those discharges. So I guess this is about acknowledging we know what a really, really difficult, challenging job it is. Next slide, please, Crystal. Human factors have a massive role to play, and on one of our previous webinars, Richard went into human factors in depth, but civility and the culture of the organisation have a huge role to play. You're almost balancing which tool to bring out on any given time. Is it time for the carrot? Is it time for the stick? And the whole time balancing risk and managing risk. Next slide, please, Crystal. A huge amount is about the culture of the organisation, and I feel very strongly executive support to that office. A bit like today, it'll be like Cobra, dealing with the heat waves, and leadership and supporting staff and the whole ABCs are critical to this role and to Focused. Next slide, please, Crystal. As I said, everything we do has an element of risk, but what we're doing on a daily basis in site management or on a minute by minute basis is all about balancing it. Next slide, please. You won't be surprised to know that what we don't have is a silver bullet that can fix it all, because otherwise we'd all be millionaires and life would be a lot easier. But in pulling together Focused and in pulling together this self-assessment, as I said, it's best practice from all over the country. What we've tried to do is approach site management in a structured way. And as Helen goes into the self-assessment, what it will do, even if you're a really high functioning site team, it will identify areas and opportunities for improvement that you can continue to strive to be even better than you already are. So I'm going to hand over to Helen now, I think.
Lovely, thank you, Annie. My name is Helen Krasinski. I'm an improvement manager at ESIST, a nurse by background, ops, so it's ED nurse, ops and improvement. So really just going to really go through the focused site management model and just give you a flavour of what that is. But specifically today, as we said, we're going to be looking at the assessment tool. So focused site management model is an overarching set of principles that is to reduce variation and enable intelligent, data-driven decision making for forward planning and escalation. And I won't read the entire slide, but I think the principles are pretty obvious there. So we'll move on. And focused site management model is a set of overarching principles written in a mnemonic structure, so that actually we can work through each element of that concisely. And then so the front door, for example, has principles that will sit under the overarching principle: operational oversight and constraints, challenge, understanding and agreeing accountability, site plan and reporting, escalation and discharge. And we'll just move to the next slide, and you can take a look at the front door, because I am very aware that some people may have already heard this and we don't want to be repeating that. So if you look at the front door, these are the principles that sit under the overarching. So what is today's performance, current and predicted? These are the things that you can prompt and ask yourself. Are we actively managing the 4-hour standard within the emergency department? Do we know how many patients are at risk of 12-hour breaches, and what are we doing about that? Are we individually discussing those patients, and how are we making sure that they are safely moved from the emergency department, which we know has the potential to cause harm when you're over 6 hours? So I'm just going to quickly just give a couple of points. Under each one of these mnemonics sits multiple points, and we don't want to go through those verbatim, and you will have the slides available afterwards to have a look through. So operational oversight, whole hospital constraints, we're looking at what is the outlier position? Are all patients reviewed by a senior decision maker? Have we prioritised which area to close first? Because actually across and up and down the nation at the moment, we're opening escalation areas that we probably wouldn't have dreamed of 10 years ago. And what is impacting service delivery? So contingency plans, business continuity plans, extreme weather, prime example for today, and have we got Glastonbury happening in our local area next week? And these are predictable events and things that we actually need to manage. And then we move on to C, which is the challenge. So a bit of challenge is always healthy. It's not a chapter and verse and a Spanish Inquisition when everybody requests a bed, but actually, is this the right person? Is it an appropriate request for bed? Have they been seen by a senior decision maker? Or are we just admit at the moment because we're under severe pressure in the emergency department? Also, are internal professional standards happening, and how can the organisation help support those internal professional standards? And then we move on to understanding actions and agreeing accountability. And I think this is one of the key things that we see up and down the country as we visit many organisations and observe site management and site management meetings, is the meeting action focused? And with those actions, are they owned by somebody? Do we know what time that action needs to be completed? Are they accountable for that action? And what is the mechanisms for feeding back? And equally, are the actions circulated around the organisation? So everybody is very clear, as Tracy alluded to in the video, that we all know what our actions are, what we're accountable for, and actually we make sure they're delivered and not working in silos, and it's not just up to the few to support those actions. The site meeting element is key, that you have decision makers that are in attendance. It's completely value lost if we have people in that meeting that can't make those decisions and don't have that seniority to make that decision. So 15 minutes spent at a site management meeting at a senior level can make those decisions, which would actually have taken hours for a more junior person to seek permission within the organisation to make change. And are the actions, so is there a clear plan for the next day? Is there a clear plan for 2 hours, 8 hours, and the following day? And actually, each OPAL level, are we enacting the triggers? And is there specific actions within those triggers to avoid deterioration? And when we look at that, a good litmus test for that is, as we alluded to, is does the Band 7 charge nurse on the ward and the medical reg, for example, understand what they're doing differently at OPAL level 3 or at OPAL level 1? And you need to be really honest with yourself and ask that question, because actually, if they're just doing what they do every day and there's no different, then clearly the escalation plan isn't owned by the organisation. And clinicians, and whether you're clinical or operational, it is flow is everybody's responsibility. And then we move on to escalation. Is the escalation, have we got an escalation policy, and is it utilised? And that's from board to ward. It's not just an escalation policy between ED and the site management and the site office. It is across the entire organisation, but also including the system. And we'd look at the system for external escalation plans, and that would feed in and dovetail with the acute hospitals escalation plan. And we're talking ICS, regional and community services. And then discharge. And I really won't go on to discharge too much, because I know there's a lot of focus on discharge nationally, and obviously we're doing the hospital only discharge webinar, so I won't repeat any of those, but some of the key elements are: have we got people that are clearly identified for home today? Do we know who they are, where they are, and when they're going home? What time frame they're going home, and how will I know they've gone home? And those really simple decisions and simple tools that you'll have in your back pocket as a site manager will give you the power to manage your demand and your capacity and your flow through the organisation. And if they don't go home today, are they prioritised for the next day's early discharge? Can they go to the discharge lounge? And why didn't they go home today? And I think it's really important to look back and learn why the person didn't go home, to make sure it's not repeated today, tomorrow, next week and next year, because it will be an ongoing cycle, transport, TTOs, whatever that may be. And then next day discharge identified. As is always, places that do well know exactly who's going the next day, and they're preparing for that. And it's about being proactive rather than reactive. So we'll just move on to the next slide. This is our little flyer for our focus management principles. That's probably what you've probably already seen. It just, if you click onto that slide in the bottom right-hand corner, you'll have access to the resource pack, which is on the next slide. And this is the resource pack, which is available to you all. I'll just quickly run through. So we've got an introductory slide pack, and that introductory slide pack goes in detail into all of the principles and underlying principles of the focus tool. We've got the rapid improvement guide, which exactly what it is says on the tin. It's a 2-pager 1.5. We tried to get it on 1, but it wouldn't quite fit. So 1.5 page of some high-level principles of the focus management tools. And then we've got the self-assessment template, which I'll be walking through and talking through in a little while. The webinar recording, which dovetails with the presentation on the first on the number 1 of those tools in the toolkit, and it's the webinar that accompanies that, so it goes into detail and explanation. We've got an infographic, which is a great poster, which we would suggest that really you could pin up in your site office, and it's just to jog your memory, to have a quick look at, and to make sure that we're covering all the elements that we think we want to cover in a site manager. And sometimes when you've got the uncomfortable silence, have a little look at that. I'm sure you could pick something up to ask in the meeting at that point. And then, of course, we understand that site management has been the poor relation for many, many years. Where is the development, the training, the recognition of site management models and site management teams? So we did a literature review just to confirm that we weren't just, pulling that out of our heads, really. And actually, nationally and internationally, there's very little models with structure and formalized processes and approaches to site management. So there is a gap there, and I think obviously you all feel that day in and day out. And when you travel to different organisations, you can equally see that as well, that practice varies so dramatically between each organisation, whether you're north of the country or down in the south. And then we've got the link to the video of Kingston that we developed with them. We recognise them as doing some really great stuff. And in the spirit of not having somebody come in to present every time when we're presenting a video, it's a video of good practice we thought would have been really helpful. So we'll move on to the next slide. And this is the focus of today, really. And you have to excuse the pun. We also focus an awful lot through this webinar. So completing the self-assessment tool. And now this is something that you would need to invest some time in. And it actually is a face-to-face workshop rather than Teams, because the most rich conversations come out when you've got that team in the room and you start working together as a team. Equally, if you're a clinician that's involved in this right from the beginning, you've got that buy-in, you've got that engagement and understanding of how we've come to the conclusions and the outcomes that we've found after doing the tool. So you would expect to have a head of capacity in the patient flow team at all levels. Executive buy-in is so important because actually it's top-down, bottom-up approach of this. It really absolutely is, because it is across the whole organisation. ED, of course, would be a nurse and a doctor if possible, specialty representation, matron ward manager and service managers, or ops representation. Next slide, please. So the self-assessment tool is an Excel spreadsheet that we've developed, as in Annie was saying, we've gone up and down the country, looked at good practice and put some principles onto a page that are in a structured format. And equally, we've weighted those as well, so we can see which are the priorities and which are going to have the highest outcomes for making change within your organisation. It's it's clinically and operationally to shape your improvement journey, and I think it's really important that it's an improvement journey. That if you look at the principles, there's no way on earth that you could implement all of those principles in 6 months. So it's a bit about being really clear where the priorities are, and this will help you identify your successes and your celebrations, but equally your priorities and where the focus is needed right now. The instructions are on the front page, but it's just worth mentioning at this point. There's a score of 0 to 4. 0 is obviously the lower end, and 4 is that it's fully embedded and working consistently. We also weight them, as I said, 1 to 3, score of 1 to 3 on to influence outcomes of that. And there is repeated questions, because actually some of those questions sit across every single element of the focused model and are not individual to a division, a department or a team. So now I think this should work. We've taken the bullet. And we think that I can now. Have you okayed it, Crystal? Perfect. I love it when a plan comes together. We've had 2 techie things. So can you actually all see that?
Everything looks okay, Helen. Yeah.
Lovely. Thank you. What I'll do is I'll zoom in and zoom out as we go through. So I don't know if any of you have ever used the CQC Patient First self-assessment tool. This is a tool based on a similar idea that we'll go through elements write some narrative about each element of the focus model and the principles, and then give yourselves a score. And it's really important that you're open and honest and no blame throughout this entire process. So this is the front page, and clearly you would have purpose of the document. I'm not going to read all this, instructions for use and ongoing improvement. So what I've actually done today is filled in the document itself. This is an anonymous hospital, St. Helen Krasinski, I think it's called. And I've just given, it's easier when you see it and when you can look at it and you can feel it. So I've just popped some bits in here, and you can see that here's your scoring. Just made that slide. Sorry, it's a little bit clunky, but I think it's really helpful to see it. So zero is not in place. 1, you would score as in development. 2, in place but incomplete. 3, your score would be in place but not consistently followed. And 4 would be in place and reliably followed. And I think where you're going to have most discussion is between the 2 and 3. I wouldn't get too caught up on it, but you will genuinely get the feel yourselves when you're having that discussion in the room, whether we've really got it complete, and is it in there, and is it everybody aware about it, and are we consistently following it? So I just zoom out a little bit slightly there, and we'll go over to the first question. So the first question would be, is predictive activity, and I'm only going to go through one, don't worry, used to assess the current position? And obviously you can put your narrative in here. That narrative is really important for when you're looking back at your assessment tool, when you may be formulating an action plan, that you can put that narrative in there. It's very specific to your organisation. So, I mean, I've done a high level, current and predicted activity is visible but not utilised proactively. So therefore we'd say it's incomplete. Or you could argue the toss of actually, you know, it's there, we all know about it, but we're not necessarily using it every day. You could pop a 3 in there. And as you work through the spreadsheet, you can see you then can go on to operational oversight, which has got exactly the same, and all the principles that sit under it turned into a question format, and a format that hopefully you would understand. So in the first column, you've got the overarching question, and next to it, it's a bit more detail about what the question asks, then the weighting, and then you've got your assessment, your narrative, and your current score. And then when you put all of those together, you'll come to the end and you'll have your outputs. And I think this is where it really comes into a valuable tool, in my opinion. Please correct me if I'm wrong, but we've all worked in situations when someone says implement focused and you can't see the wood for the trees because there's just too much in it. But actually what would be really helpful and really supportive and really, you know, an opportunity within our organisation. So the gap analysis summary just goes through the mnemonic headings of the overarching principles. You can then see your scores from that gap analysis. So you can see that front door has scored, you know, between 2 and 3 on average. But then you look at discharge, and that's way down there, looking at 1s. You know, we're scoring 1s on that, which is your lower denomination. So at a glance, you can easily see, do you know what? We need to do some work with discharge. The site plan looks like it's okay. There may be a few bits that we're going to touch within that. And clearly, operational oversight and challenge is another area that we need to look. So if we're going to pick one priority would be discharge, 2 would then follow, that would be some focused areas that we can work on. I think it's really worth saying it's not up to one group to do this, because if you look very cannily, most of these are in already existing working groups and improvement groups. You will have an emergency improvement group that's working on something at the moment that you could look at some of these elements within your assessment that could be easily transferred and adopted within that work stream. So for example, discharge. So you can now see here, you can click on which principle that you would like. So for example, we've got discharge here, and you can see what the weighting is, what the current scores, and where we would like to be for. Would I ever see an organisation that scores 4s across the board for everything? No, I doubt it. We're always on that improvement journey, and actually things change. Something that you might have been a 4 on a year ago now currently suddenly isn't a 4. So if we look at say for the last one, is there assurance process in place to ensure all patients are discharged from the electronic system? And you scored a 0. So actually, that is so important when you look at, and that is weighted as a 3, because actually if we don't know on the electronic discharge summary if patients are going home, how can we ever plan for flow? How can we ever allocate patients to the right persons? How can we ensure that we've got that smooth, safe, timely flow within the organisation for your assessment units and your other areas within the organisation? And then obviously this just, oops. Can you see me?
We can see the Teams. That's it. You're back to it.
I got carried away with my clicker, I think. There we go. We're back on. Can you see that, everybody?
Yeah.
Perfect. So, and then with this, you can go on to front door, understanding actions, challenge, and each one of these can be quite easily cut and pasted into an improvement plan if you wish. And you can then obviously put your own interpretation of what that means within your organisation underneath each one of those principles. It's quite straightforward, really. We've tried to make it as user friendly. I think the investment really, I'll just take that off. The investment will be in making sure that you've spent that time initially with the right people in the room, getting the right assessment. And once you've done that, you can use this, and then obviously then go back over time and score yourself against where you were 6 months ago. Have we made improvements, and does it feel better now? Moving on to the next one. So we'll just go on to the next slide now. I'm sure you're all sort of quite tired of my voice. So this is where we find ourselves. This is we find ourselves. I say the royal we. It's actually you. It's you people that are out there on the shop floor, on the front line, every day between that rock and a hard place. And actually, it's really tough. And we can try and support you with these principles, and absolutely are really willing to support. And if anyone would like to get in touch with us, then we're more than happy to go through the assessment model with you and support you through that process. So we're going over to the most important part, which is now Q&A. And what I would say is, do feel free within the audience, if you feel that you've got a great solution, to also respond to the questions, because it is about sharing. It's not about myself, Andy, and Erica being the font of all knowledge. It's about making sure that we're sharing good practice within organisations that are actually at the coalface now. So thank you very much, and we'll move over. Erica, have we got any questions?
We do. So firstly, thank you from me. I have to say, although I hear the presentation in different formats regularly, I always learn something new, or I find out something different. And the self-assessment is definitely perhaps something for colleagues to kind of consider further. And for me, I guess it helps to chunk up that improvement into manageable and bite-sized chunks. I guess you said, doing it all at once feels incredibly overwhelming. So even within each category, there's an opportunity to perhaps pick the kind of key things that are of greater value. And I think you emphasized the point that this was principles, and it's for people then to translate and interpret those principles organizationally in a way that is meaningful to them. So the customization, I guess, comes at local level. I'm sure colleagues will be thinking of lots of questions, but we have a very interesting question from Jane Conroy in Gateshead, and I'll ask the question on her behalf, but Jane, feel free to come in. She's asked, and Helen, I'll ask you, but feel free to pass the question around to colleagues as well, whether the model has been evaluated formally at any stage. And I guess the question reflected particularly, obviously, changing pressures, COVID, ambulance handover pressures particularly.
That's a really great question. Thank you very much. And I think I'll probably be okay to answer this one, but it's relatively new, and we are developing it. We're utilising it in organisations, making tweaks, and it's a live document, and it will be continually under development as we move forward. And it's more of a journey, and feedback from everybody that's utilising it will only improve it as we move forward. Formal evaluation we've not undertaken formal evaluation of it because we're not that far in. And I think that will be a process that we'll absolutely take forward, because there's no point putting something in and we don't evaluate what the outcomes are and what the benefits are and strengths and the changes that are needed to happen. So really good question. And yes, we will be, but we haven't at the moment.
Jane, I hope that's answered your question quite nicely. So we'll open the questions now to the floor. Has anybody got any questions for Helen or Annie?
Don't be shy. You need to get a full hour out of this session before you go back and face the madness of the Opal 4 and the heat wave.
I have a couple on standby, Annie, but we have hands up already. Hello, Claire. Welcome to the session. We'll hand over to you for your question.
Hi, thank you. I was just typing it into the chat, but I'll ask you instead. So in the self-assessment on the output tab, I just want to double check with you. So the top section with the summary, is that purely the current and to be, or has there been a weighted calculation added into the averages on the top one? If I'm making sense.
Yeah, it's there's an average on the overarching. So front door, for example, would be your average. Oh, you know, the current would be your average score, and then the 2B is you know, utopian world where we've got unicorns, because you'd be 4 out of 4 and perfect on everything. So you know, it's you know, we've set that, you know, as 100%. But equally, you could set your own trajectories of where you want to get to in a time frame if you're using that as a project management type support tool. So yeah, absolutely, it's that, and it's really important to say that I mentioned it twice, but the weighted element of it is what would have most impact. So you know, really, discharges, do we know how many discharges there are on a daily basis, will clearly be weighted heavily, opposed to something that will not have such an impact, will be weighted at a 1. And actually, as we move forward, we may look at some of those and think, you know, things will change. You know, COVID has changed so many things. There might be something else out there that will change, that we may then change the weighting. But to be quite honest, it's all relative within your organisation, that you're going to get the understanding just through those rich conversations with the teams about where you stand.
Okay, thank you.
Any other questions from anybody? While we're waiting for colleagues to think about some further questions, which I'm sure there will be very shortly, Helen and Annie, one of the things that kind of really struck me about the video that you both kindly shared was the emphasis on ownership and accountability. And I wonder whether there is, I guess, from your travels, any experience you can share on approaches organisations have taken to foster that kind of ownership and accountability, because it doesn't develop overnight, does it?
Yeah, I'm sorry, I seem to be answering a lot, but my Wi-Fi playing up, is it?
We can hear you, Helen.
Okay, I shall continue. So as an organisation, we've recently been supporting that 18 months ago, there was extremely long ambulance queues, for probably one of the top 5 in nationally. And the feeling, the normalization of it was that actually they're not, I've almost forgotten the question, but was that they are not, they're not our problem, they're not our responsibility, and we don't need to enact on that. And actually that was then just overlooked, and continued behaviours, continued normalisation. And then actually the executive team, you know, made a real stance about, actually we've got to, you know, and nationally there was a real drive to, we've got to reduce these ambulance delays. And they were given the ownership and accountability to implement a set of trigger tools to put things in place that would massively reduce that ambulance queue. And they really did it, and they really did it themselves, with clinicians, with nursing, with medicine, with ops teams, involving the site team and the executive team to support some pressure points, you know, to be relieved, as in like an escalation area that was staffed by the wards, by the hospital. And I think that was top to bottom ownership. They owned it, they implemented it, and to this very day it's still consistently working. And it was really rapid, actually, from that one culture to do a 360, to flip to another culture, that we own this and this is our issue. And I think sometimes when you're talking about organisational ownership, that's probably where it falls down a little bit, because who is accountable for that ambulance of 15 hours on the forecourt? And you'll end up with 10 or 15 different answers depending who you ask within an organisation. Well, you all are, you know, because you're all accountable for flow. However, there will be one person at the end of the day that is. So absolutely, it's absolutely key.
Helen, thank you very much for that. We've got some more questions in the chat, but we'll go to Andy first. Andy, would you also like to introduce yourself? Because you've obviously been involved in the focus model as well.
Yeah, certainly, Erica. Andy Aldridge, and I'm also an improvement manager from eSyst. My hand was up really just to kind of agree with and just add to Helen's comments. Absolutely agree with everything that Helen said. I think what came through loud and clear on the Kingston video was the ownership of flow by medicine, by nursing, by operations in equal measure, really. And I think your question alluded to, didn't it, Erica? As we go up and down the country, where do we see good flow and site management being successful? It's where flow is in everybody's portfolio. It's owned by everybody, so it sits within the nursing portfolio, it sits within the medical portfolio, because flow is nothing more than a set of actions that we use to propel a patient through their journey, really, through a hospital. And some of those are clinical actions, some of them are operational actions, but that's what it is. And everybody needs to own their bit of that, really. Hopefully that's just added a little bit to what Helen was saying.
It certainly has, Andy, and it emphasises, doesn't it, that particularly for flow, this is definitely a team sport we're talking about, because it requires not just effort from everybody, but also, for me, the expertise of everybody involved, because everybody will bring something slightly different. So it's that, I guess, coupled with people's individual understanding of their roles and responsibilities. Graham, you put a question in the chat. I wonder if you'd be happy to come on screen and ask it. You asked specifically about monitoring Pathway Zero. Shall we hand over to you?
Yeah, so I'm on screen and I've got my camera on. Hopefully you can all hear me, and my Wi-Fi isn't too dodgy. So I manage the integrated discharge team, the Pathway 1, 2 and 3 in old money discharges, for want of a better way of saying it. And quite often when we're having those conversations about totality of discharges, the Pathway Zeros, of course, are generally ward-based, and quite often we're chasing to see how many we're going to discharges we're going to get through the day. So I've just put some comments in the chat. My question is, how do we consistently manage and monitor the Pathway Zeros to make sure we get good flow, and also to make sure we get as many out in the morning as we possibly can? The old-fashioned golden patients, as we all talk about.
So for me, Graham, I would say keeping your Pathway Zeros as close to the front door as you possibly can within your assessment and short stay area. Once they get beyond that and get into the base wards, then they become more difficult to track.
Okay, well, that's certainly one option, but as you know, with all the continuous pressure at the moment, keeping them in the front door is quite a challenge. I do understand the principle, but is there any other suggestions as well, if we can't quite manage everybody in the front, bearing in mind the current heat wave, etc., where we're having to bed people rapidly?
I'd absolutely, and your Pathway Zero are your golden patients. They are your next day discharge. They're your predictables. They're your ones that are going to go home without too much intervention. Yeah. And it's absolutely, you see it differently in different organisations. What I've seen worked really well is a named list of exactly where everybody is, with notes beside that, within the site office, so everyone knows who is going. Because you could say Ward 3 has got 4 Pathway Zero discharges today. What does that mean to anybody? It doesn't really tell you anything. It's the devil's in the detail that Andy Aldridge is going home today on a Pathway Zero. He's suitable for the discharge lounge, and he's just waiting for his TTOs. And it's almost keeping that, absolutely making those golden patients your priority. They're your quick wins. They're your ones that are going to get the decompress the emergency department assessment areas first thing in the morning, and try and balance that demand and capacity curve that is always mismatched in all organisations. So it is really about, part of that element is having the rigour and the control within the site office, the divisional teams that own it. So you would expect the matrons and the clinicians to understand who is on a pathway to zero today, and are they being prioritised? Is there anything we can do? If there's something that's delaying it, the escalation post, that's what it's there for. So transport's a real issue. They were coming at 11, now they're coming at 6 o'clock tonight. We've rung them, they're not going to do anything. What can we do? And then it's about maybe even putting it out to your system partners that we've got 5 patients that can go home now. Transport, what can we do as a system to support those early discharges? And I know it's all things that you'll probably already do and have already put in place, but it is about getting that mindset of they are actually a priority, because they're your quick wins, those Pathway Zeros, without a shadow of a doubt.
I think just to add on to that, Erica, if I may. So the only bit I'd add there, Graham, I think really is just taking it back, and I don't want to sound like a stuck record here. I'm at risk of that, I think. Taking it back to the flow is everybody's flow is everybody's issue, really. So really, the patients on the wards are the clinical teams who work the wards, and I guess what I'm talking about here is the cultural piece of everybody owning this, because the people who really know these patients, these pathway zeros, and can do the most with them are the clinical teams who work there. So it is getting full buy-in from everybody. It absolutely is. It's probably a bit of each of those, but you know, that adds a bit to it, I guess.
Thank you.
Thanks very much, everybody. I guess we keep circling back, don't we, to the issue of individual ownership and accountability and the clarity at individual level of those roles and responsibility, so that it becomes business as usual rather than something we are trying to force and make happen. Claire Lambie, hopefully I pronounced your surname correctly.
Yeah, thank you very much. Just a quick question, really. I think it looks a really good tool that we can objectively use to kind of see where because we all think we know where we are and we all think we know what our problems are. I suppose for me, there's two questions. We've obviously got the 100-day discharge challenge. So it's, do we cleverly use this tool to support us where we move on with the 100-day discharge challenge? And the other thing for me is around culture, because we have tried times many. We've done patient first, we've done the 21-day length of stay pieces of work to try and improve flow in the organisations. We've looked at safer, red to green, making every day count, and we're still not getting that cultural shift. So I'm just wondering if anybody's got any ideas on how we start that movement and how we get that change in culture and sustain it, because we get it and then we lose it. Thank you. Multiple questions.
So I think in terms of the culture is always one of the most difficult things to lift and to shift or to change. But I think if you're using the self-assessment in a workshop style, and I see someone's put in the chat, normally when we're doing this on site, the workshop generally takes about 2.5 hours. And if you've got the right people in the room, you know, representation from ED to execs, a lot of the beauty in completing it comes out of the conversation. You'll find that some people didn't think, you know, there was an assumption that the site team did that, or they don't know what the expectations on themselves is or are.
Absolutely, Annie, and I think that's the start of the journey of the culture, you know, actually to have all different levels in a room to listen to each other and to understand without blame. And it's never going to be a quick fix. Doing this assessment tool is not going to immediately fix it, but it's the start of a journey that we've all sat around a table, we've had coffee and biscuits, we've discussed it, and we've had warts and all, and it's a no blame culture where we're supportive and challenging of each other. That it's a start. It's a start for just even start to change one of those elements that you're going to identify, because you can absolutely guarantee what's identified in the focused assessment tool on the D element of that will be exactly what you're seeing within your improvement plans, and it almost gives that evidence and a different look at it. We're going to do it from a flow point of view rather than a ward-based, you must change your board rounds, you must change, you know, how can we do this differently? And those conversations across the board, operational, clinical, you know, when do you get that rich variety of people in a room to have a conversation?
Yeah.
Andy, anything you would want to add about this before I check if Helen wants to comment specifically about this question?
It's probably been covered, really. I think, you know, from experience of doing these as workshops, do them as face-to-face workshops, which has already been said. But the quality of the conversation that comes out in those workshops, if they're genuinely honest and open, and there's a no blame culture, the quality of the conversations, you may find that they run on, and actually the value is in the conversation. It really is. That's where you're going to benefit from this, and that's what we've seen when we've done these workshops previously. It's quite useful, I think, if we're external to the trust. So if we're running them, we kind of external to the trust, we can kind of push a little bit and play that role as well, which is also useful. It doesn't necessarily have to have us there. I'm not saying that. That's not what I'm suggesting. But what I'm saying is somebody external can sometimes ask the difficult question that isn't always easy to ask.
Sorry to cut back in. So Andy, based on that, we would be more than happy for you to come and help us to do that self-assessment, or the team, if that offer's there.
Okay. So I'll put my email address in the chat box, and drop me an email. Is that all right, Claire?
Perfect. No, brilliant. Thank you.
Claire, will you permit me to check with Helen if she wanted to come in specifically about this point, and then we'll bring you in after Helen. Helen.
Lovely, thank you. Afternoon all. Really great listening to all this, and the Q&A absolutely always brings the richest conversation. I've just got a couple of points, if I may, for Graham and Claire around pathway 0 patients. We've just done a recent piece of work with the team chief nursing officers up in the Midlands around really understanding what the front-facing staff, their reality is. And I think, Claire, you just touched on it in regards to, you know, we think we know what the reality is, but until you actually double check yourself, they might be thinking something completely different is the blocker for somebody's discharge. And I think what we sort of learned from some of their feedback was not everybody is really aware of what role they individually play in discharge. So everyone's got competing priorities. And everyone's priority is their priority, isn't it? So it's very difficult when you're really just up against it, and that's, you know, you're following what you think is the right thing, but actually, so that vision and that leadership throughout all of the, you know, from the bottom up and the top down, really needs to be consistent about what the priorities are. But equally, the important piece is making sure that all patient-facing staff really appreciate their own individual impact and what a difference it makes to the patients that are not only going home and the deconditioning that happens as a result of staying in hospital, but also the impact on the patients that are waiting to come into those, you know, those hospital beds, and the impact of an extra hour or an extra half an hour. All of those things that actually might sound quite small, but it has such a huge impact on the patients and their relatives and their loved ones. I think some of the messaging around patients going home and the, you know, deconditioning and the harmful effects that can cause, and that's how you hook people in with that why. That tends to be clinically what you know, nursing staff and AHPs and all clinical teams and everybody that's working with patients really will actually hook into, because it really does make the difference. What we're trying to do nationally also is to try and get the comms campaign to support that, so that everybody, you know, without wanting to scaremonger everybody, but people are aware that actually best place is at home, isn't it? When you're well enough to be out of an acute hospital, best place is at home, rather than keeping people in just for that extra day, extra. And just the last bit before Claire comes in, I know we're going to be really tight on time. It's that consistency, and I know Helen and Annie just mentioned it. It sounds really quite boring, doesn't it? But if you just have to keep going with that consistent approach, you know, what you're saying in your bed meetings, what you're asking people to bring back, what your leadership and the way in which you're asking for the information, so that everyone's aware of what the expectations from you as leaders are and what they have to bring back to make sure that everyone's got the right level of detail when you're trying to organise your discharging and your patient flows from beginning to end. So that consistency, because as soon as you don't do it, someone will notice straight away, won't they? And they'll be, no, actually we didn't do that yesterday. But no, it's every day, day in, day out, and it might be quite boring, but it's really noticeable when it doesn't happen. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Helen. That was a very useful intervention. Claire, I will also send you some resources and a link to an earlier conversation we had about internal professional standards, which I think may help some of the conversation you want to kind of start at your kind of at your trust. We've got a final 3 minutes, and we'll bring Claire in because she's been waiting incredibly patiently, and then we'll call the session to a close. Claire.
It was just in reply to Graham really about Pathway 0. So, and it was linked to everything that's been talked about today. I'm Claire Old, I'm one of the assistant improvement managers, but the team know I'm really interested in social care as well as health and social care. So it's for me, it's about the fact that we need to remind everybody that it's not just hospital people that work in hospitals. There are loads of social workers, there are loads of people in other teams that are linked to patients that are picking up your discharges for you, and they're really useful people to get to know. In Telford and Wrekin, Shropshire, Telford and Wrekin, Pathway 0 as a concept started, and they had a team who were in the hospital picking up, it was a team from the council picking up the Pathway 0 patients and pulling them out of the hospital and taking them out into voluntary services, because they saw the value of all of the informal voluntary services out in the community. Because and they did it because we did it, because a lot of people were going into pathway 1 when actually they didn't require pathway 1. All they required was a lower level of voluntary support. So my plea is, you need to realise what's going on in your hospitals, because sometimes I don't think we know that those teams are in there. So for example, our team started probably 5 years ago. If you were a new member of staff in the discharge team or in site management, you might even not know that those teams were working on the wards. So it's about getting to know the extra staff, not just your own, that are doing something, and then using your whole integrated team. And it was just to say to the whole team, we've got fantastic WhatsApp groups. So we've got the discharge WhatsApp group, we've got the ED WhatsApp group, and we've got the site management WhatsApp group. And I know that everybody probably on this call knows about it, but those 3 groups, but they're really useful because they're populated by real people and the assist managers. Not real people, of course, but people who are doing the job, Graham, you know, and so they will give you solutions from the front line that they've worked up. So Shropshire and Telford will tell you about their team, but that might not be appropriate for you, but you might find somebody who's doing the same as you and get some tips from them. So, you know, any one of us, just send your WhatsApp phone to and we'll get you on any group that you want to, and they are there to help you, and you're there to help them. It's a service that we're doing for teams to help each other. Thank you.